Greetings and welcome to a special edition of the University of Minnesota Alumni Association's webinar series. My name is John Ruzek and I'm the Senior Director of Alumni Networks for the Alumni Association. Thank you to all alumni and friends who have made time to join us live today. Today's webinar, A Citizen's Guide to Ebola, is presented by one of the world's most sought-after experts on infectious disease threats and international health, Dr. Michael Osterholm of the University of Minnesota, who will give an overview of key aspects of the Ebola epidemic and what the public really needs to know. This webinar is part of a new free series being offered by the University of Minnesota Alumni Association, where we're having conversations with experts about career, life, and learning topics. The webinar is being recorded and will be viewable afterwards at minnesotaalumni.org/alumni webinar series. Just give us a few business days to post it on our website, and we'll also send a reminder email to participants who are joining us today. And if you're on Twitter right now, tweet at us with the hashtag UMNWebinar. We'd love to hear from you. You can also follow the University of Minnesota Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, SidReach, on Twitter. You see their handle there as well. Before we get started, let's go over a few items so you know how to best participate in today's event. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer speakers by default. If you'd prefer to listen over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane of your GoToWebinar panel and dial-in information will be displayed. If you experience audio difficulties while listening via your computer speakers, this can be caused by having multiple software applications open, which can use up your computer's bandwidth and affect network performance. So feel free to close any unnecessary applications on your computer at this time. Questions are welcome, and you may submit them at any time. Please type in your questions in the questions pane on your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll track questions along the way, and our presenter will leave time near the end of the webinar to address as many questions as we have time for. It's now my pleasure to welcome to the webinar Dr. Michael Osterholm. Dr. Osterholm is the McKnight Presidential Endowed Chair in Public Health at the University of Minnesota and Director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy. He's also a professor in the Division of Environmental Health Sciences at the School of Public Health, a professor in the Technological Leadership Institute in the College of Science and Engineering, and an adjunct professor in the medical school here at the University of Minnesota. He is also a member of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences and the Council of Foreign Relations. Dr. Osterholm is the author of more than 315 papers and abstracts, including 21 book chapters, and is a frequently invited guest lecturer on the topic of epidemiology of infectious diseases. He has received numerous honors for his work and has been the recipient of 6 major research awards from the NIH and the CDC. We're very honored that he's taken time out of his busy schedule to join us today. Welcome to the webinar, Dr. Osterholm.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Today, over the next 45 to 50 minutes, I will share with you an overview of what one might call a citizen's guide to the Ebola epidemic. And in doing that, I hope that I will be able to provide some constructive comments about where we're at and where we're going. First of all, let me just say I have no financial relationships to disclose here, and I also do not, will not discuss anything off-label or any investigation used in my presentation, and I know less about Ebola today than I did 6 months ago, so please take that information provided here with that acknowledgement. To start out, let me just comment on 2 quotes I think really set the overall stage for what we're going to talk about today. One is from Daniel Bornstein, former librarian to Congress, who once said, "The greatest obstacle to discovering the shape of the earth, the continents, and the oceans was not ignorance but the illusion of knowledge." I think you'll see today that we can safely say that we're learning a lot about Ebola as a virus, as an infectious disease, and as a interface with global public health practice and medical care. And we have a lot more to learn. Second of all, Richard Feynman, the former Nobel Prize laureate, once said, "For a successful technology, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled." I think we can also add here that for a successful public health intervention, reality must take precedence, and we're learning a great deal in that regard. Now, the next slide is really a context slide that shares with you a sense of how and why we might be concerned about Ebola in a different way today than we have in the past. As you see here, you can see how world population has increased from 1850 to 2000, and today at about 7.5 billion people. 1 of every 8 people who's lived is on the face of the earth right now. In addition, of course, with global trade and travel, while the time hasn't gotten any faster to get around the world since 1950s, the amount of people, goods, items, other things that go around the world has. These two factors have really combined to make for a potential for Ebola today to do things that, from a public health perspective, that we had not really once considered. For example, one of the areas of the fastest growing growth in human population is actually in the equatorial belt of Africa, with the new megacities there. And this is clearly an important aspect of what's happened in terms of the recent months in West Africa. Now, to give a basic background on the Ebola virus and its human infection, it was named after the Ebola River in what was then Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It was first discovered in 1976 in a very remote rural village area. Since that time, there have been 24 outbreaks or isolated case occurrences documented, of which 20 of these were community-wide outbreaks. So in a sense very limited. Likely before 1976 such outbreaks also occurred, but because of the very sparse human population in equatorial Africa, it's unlikely that any of these would have been large outbreaks or ongoing and sustaining. When you look at the total number of people that were known to be cases in these 20 outbreaks, that was numbered about 2,400. Most of the transmission was extremely limited. For the Ebola Sudan outbreak, there was probably 15 different generations, and that was it. A generation being from person 1 to person 2 is one generation, from person 2 to person 3. But for the virus that we're dealing with today, Ebola Zaire, the most number of transmission generations was 5. And in this regard, we can summarize really by saying Ebola has hardly pinged the human species before the current West Africa outbreak, and really is an important context point again to understand what do we know and not know about this infection. Now, in terms of how Ebola virus is transmitted, this is an area that we know a lot about, but if you could imagine our knowledge base for this is like a normal curve, where 98% of the curve is fairly well known to us and something that we can describe with some accuracy. Clearly, the tails, the 1% on either side of the curve, is yet really unclear to us, and we have things to learn about it. So, but what we do know is that with direct contact from an infected person or animal body fluids, including blood, vomit, feces, and possibly perspiration, is the primary mechanism for transmission. The current outbreaks highlighted questions about transmission. For example, early on we placed a great deal of emphasis on the presence or absence of fever. We'll talk about that. We'll talk briefly about the issue of what has been labeled airborne transmission, and also just the issue about worker safety. Despite the recent interest and concern about healthcare worker transmission and safety here in the United States or in the EU, we must understand that while these are important cases, we must not take our eye off the ball, which is really about Africa. And today this presentation will continue to highlight all the aspects of Ebola in Africa. Now, I mentioned earlier, just as an example of the questions about what we know and don't know, here is a very nice review by the World Health Organization Ebola Response Team published in the New England Journal of Medicine in mid-October, summarizing the first 9 months of the epidemic with some comments on future projections. One of the things to note here, despite this case definition requiring fever or else to be tested for Ebola virus and found positive, which would favor, in fact, finding patients with fever, only 87.1% of cases reported a fever throughout the course of their illness. This is a point to make that we have to be very careful about absolutes, and there have been, I think, an effort by many to do a better job of that. But early on in the public concern about Ebola, we did, as a public health community, make very absolute statements out of, I think, a obvious need to or desire to assure the public about various aspects of transmission. Today we'll talk more about that as we realize that not everything is going to be in clear black and white. If we look at the disease itself in this slide here, you can see the predominant symptoms of fever, fatigue, loss of appetite, vomiting, and diarrhea. You can also go and look at this more carefully for those who died or those who recovered. But the point to make is the traditional viewed picture of Ebola, which was really put forward in books like The Hot Zone, of copious amounts of bleeding out of the eyes and so forth, is really not the case. What we see here, if you look down, blood and stool, gums, bloody nose, bloody cough, it really is just a few percent of those individuals, as high as 18% among the general number of cases who had unexplained bleeding, but generally it was very small. What you're really doing with the disease, it presents primarily as a constellation of fatigue, loss of appetite, vomiting, and diarrhea. And these are, again, the symptoms today that, along with fever, we would urge people to be mindful of. If someone has developed an illness and had recent travel to West Africa, the affected countries, or contact with someone who was there. What do we know about Ebola virus ecology? Well, this is one that we still have lots of questions about. One outbreak clearly was able to demonstrate that fruit bats were the source, but beyond that, it's unclear exactly what the natural reservoir is for the Ebola virus, particularly Ebola Zaire. If you look at this very nice cartoon from the CDC, you can see this reservoir being portrayed as being bats, and it's very possible that that is the primary and only reservoir, with then transmission into other animal species, what we call a sylvatic cycle. And there you can see transmission, whether it be subhuman primates, bats, and other animals, then getting to humans through contact with these animal species, most often usually around a food source exposure, where someone either finds a dead animal or a sick animal and then basically prepares that for a meal, with contact occurring with the body fluids of that animal. We still have much to learn about this whole sylvatic cycle, where the virus resides in between the times when we don't have or haven't had outbreaks. If we look at the belt here of where we're talking about countries with index reported cases and countries at risk without reported cases, you can get a sense of looking at the rainforest and where we're looking at the potential for these cases. West Africa, as we know, the three primary affected countries today, shouldn't have been a surprise, yet in a sense they were, because we had not seen in our 40-some-year history Ebola virus transmission there. We began following this situation in March at the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, recognizing that initially this seemed to be just another Ebola outbreak, in this case in a slightly different location in the equatorial belt. But it became very clear to us, at least early on, that this was a different situation, and a number of NGOs, particularly the Doctors Without Borders or MSF, made it very clear that they believed that this was different, that it wasn't being brought under control using the same kind of public health intervention methods of identifying cases quickly, isolating them in medical care, and following up contacts. Now, some of this clearly had to do with a lack of adequate response due to the lack of public health and medical care infrastructure in the affected countries. But also, it seemed as if something else was happening. If we look at this particular pictorial here, this cartoon in the right-hand bottom, you can see the conjoining areas of Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, where the outbreak first began, and from there then spread throughout the other three countries throughout their entire area. I wrote a piece actually in the Washington Post in late July, in which this was before the cases had occurred and were brought to the public's attention around American physicians brought home, which would seem to be a very important event in terms of highlighting the issue. One of the things that you'll note in the second paragraph I started, unfortunately today's outbreak is very different, and tried to explain that this really did seem to be very, very different. And what I hypothesized in this piece was it wasn't because the virus had changed, it's because Africa had changed. And I'm not so sure that's the case today. I think as we gain more information, we may see that this virus is slightly different in terms of its ability to cause disease and such things as virus load or titer and so forth. But the bottom line is it did fall into a geographic area where the health and public health infrastructure were generally virtually nil to absent, and the fact that there was intense personal crowding in, for lack of a better term, the slums of the major cities in the rural area. We also had some successes early on, and this is one of the things that has made this situation a bit more complicated in terms of understanding. If you look here, again, the 3 impacted cases, but I want to highlight this slide because of one case occurred in Senegal early on, as well as a case that was introduced into Nigeria. Let me spend more time on the Nigerian situation where, in fact, an individual who was infected in Liberia flew to Lagos, Nigeria. It occurred at a time when the public health care system was actually, or the public health system was on strike, and this individual was hospitalized actually in a private hospital, which provided, in a sense, a higher level of care. This was a good thing because of the fact that it really limited his contact and the potential in a lack of adequate health care setting to be cared for. The problem is that there still was transmission that occurred in this setting, and I think one of the really remarkable achievements so far to date was the combined effort of the Nigerian health and public health systems along with the CDC to actually limit and stop this ongoing chain of transmission that occurred, again, primarily in healthcare workers. This outbreak required over 1,000 people to be followed up. And I only show this because this slide has often been used in the story in Nigeria as an example of how we can still stop this in Africa. I would suggest to you that the same patient entered Nigeria but spent time in the slums of Lagos and was not detected early, and there had been several generations of transmission. The outcome could have been very different. We are seeing that today, as we now actually have 8 cases in Mali over the last 2 weeks, of which we now are concerned about a new focus of transmission there, so that we recognize also the lack of preparedness, even though this is right on the border with Guinea. This individual who was able to move freely from Guinea to Mali, who was infected, who then started this new chain of transmission. A very similar effort that was conducted with the individual who flew into Nigeria is being done here. The question is, will it be able to be stopped here? But it points out the vulnerability of the rest of Africa to what I call the infectious disease forest fire of the 3 affected countries, sending sparks throughout other areas of Africa and the world. Now, in terms of understanding current case numbers, these are the data from this week from the World Health Organization. We all recognize there's been massive underreporting, and again, it just goes to speak to the functionality of the public health system there. To date, there have been 15,351 cases reported, 5,459 deaths. The transmission remains most intense in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, with the more recent cases, now 8 cases in Mali. We suspect that this may be underreporting by as much as 3. More recently, it may be less than that. So you may be talking about as many as 45,000 cases, as many as almost 16,000 deaths. It's unclear. But I think to put this into perspective, which, by the way, remember we had only 2,400 cases total in all of the Ebola epidemics up to this point, so it gives you some perspective. But where are we going? There have been a number of attempts to provide some estimate, and I show this slide. It's only as of August, and I wanted intentionally to give you a sense of this early increase in cases, which set the tone for how people made estimates for future case numbers. In this very early window of just a few weeks, we then extrapolated numbers which were quite remarkable. The debate has gone on and on about how many cases will there really be, what does it matter what we have done or not have done with regard to public health and medical interventions. In that same article I showed you earlier, published on September 23rd, the World Health Organization, based on their modeling, concluded that there may be as many as 20,000 cases in total by November 2nd. Well, as reported cases go, as you know, that's not the case. It's 15,000. If you look at unreported, how you factor this in, because these are reported cases here, I actually think that this estimate is actually quite remarkably good in terms of the overall assessment of what was going on. However, the same week that was published, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention published an article suggesting that they extrapolated trends to January 20th without additional interventions or changes in community behavior. The model also estimates that Liberia and Sierra Leone will have approximately 550,000 Ebola cases, about 1.4 million when corrected for underreporting. This estimate, I can tell you, having done a number of briefings in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere, was a very important driving factor in people being extremely concerned about what Ebola might or might not do. Today, we obviously are far, far under that number. Recent explanations from the CDC have been that, in fact, because of activities primarily in Liberia, these numbers will not be met. I think we just have to admit it, that these numbers really were a gross overestimate based on data that I think was unfortunately very robust. If one looks at Sierra Leone, which would have accounted for about half of these cases, remember this is only 2 countries, not 3 countries, just Sierra Leone and Liberia, we still could have expected upwards of 200 to 250,000 cases reported, and we're not going to be anywhere close to that. And Sierra Leone has not had major interventions in community behavior that could explain this issue. I just point this out because this is going to be a credibility issue over the days to come. I don't believe that anyone intentionally misled anyone into these higher numbers, but we are going to, as a public health community, be asked to address that we scare the hell out of people needlessly early on. And I think this was should be a sobering message to all of us about the need that we need to take in how we report or project future cases. My message has been for over 2.5 months there's going to be lots and lots of cases and lots of deaths, and I don't know what that number is, but I think we need to have more of that honesty in terms of our presentations. If one looks today, these are the numbers from this recent WHO report with the yellow dots in size representing the number of cases in the past 21 days. You can see the ongoing activity primarily in Sierra Leone and even continuing in Liberia, although, as I'll mention in a moment, the information in Liberia clearly does point to a reduced number of new cases, and in some cases actually leveling off to reduction in other geographic areas. Now, what can explain that? Some have suggested it could be to the fact that people will not report or provide their dead to the officials because of the concern about the mandatory cremation issue. I think this clearly cannot explain the reduction. It may be in part, but there have been very clear, I think, and evident activities in Liberia to reduce transmission. And I give the CDC a lot of credit here because they have been very much a part of that whole activity, and they've provided several nice documents discussing that. There's still, however, as I pointed out, the concern in Sierra Leone with new infection control chains continuing, and as long as this is occurring in one country, it can occur in any country, meaning that you're only as good as basically your last day's effort. If we let up the accelerator of response, we can see transmission clearly move back out of areas that had previously had major activity, then reduced activity. We know that from ongoing statements that this mixed picture is there. This is something that has been happening for some time where you see activity and then you see it reduced. This is an example here back from August where Guinea reopens an Ebola clinic as sick spill over the border. I have likened this in some cases to what I call fireworks transmission, where up until at least the last month in Liberia, we've had examples of where there's been substantial activity, then a period of reduced activity which is unexplained. Even in some cases, Ebola treatment units were actually reduced in size or moved because of the reduced activity, only to have to come back again. Now, we're hopeful that the reductions in Liberia in terms of new cases is going to be sustainable. But this is one we have to be very mindful of. Could this be a big flash with cases, goes dark, and then we have another flash again, this kind of fireworks transmission issue, or are we really sustaining the gains that we've made? A good example of the confusion that the public has is the confusion we in public health have. This is the first of 2 articles published last Friday, November 20th in the New York Times. Ebola spread has slowed in Liberia, CDC says. It talks about the idea of the worst case projections are not going to happen, which again, I've already made my comments about that. But if you read this article, you would come away with the fact that there's still concern, but that in fact we've really made great progress. On that same day, another article published in the New York Times, actually earlier in the day on the website in the print edition the next day, officials revise goals on containing Ebola after signs of wider exposure in Mali. But if you read through this entire article, you'd come away with saying, boy, this isn't quite as good as we think. We've got a lot of work to do. And I think these articles are both correct. I think they reflect the ongoing differences we see in transmission by geographic area, by time, and by our efforts. And one of the things I think we're going to have to become more comfortable with is uncertainty. That generally speaking, we still have an upward growing outbreak in at least 2 of the 3 countries, and in one of the countries it's not clear yet what's going to happen. And in this sense, we cannot let our foot off the prevention and treatment accelerator. We know that in some areas we've had shortages of beds that continue. One of the areas that I raise this point here is because one of the things we're doing is we're going back and revisiting just what do we need to do. Remember, the mantra in August and early September was treatment bed, treatment beds, treatment beds. Now we have treatment centers with no one arriving for care. And one of the issues has been, do we need to reconsider where we do treatment in the community, how we do it? Are Ebola treatment units really still the primary way? And for a number of the areas, yes. But I think that one of the things this outbreak is doing is challenging our thinking about how do we do effective Ebola treatment to both improve patient outcome, but also to better impact on the public health aspects of the epidemic. This is an article from today from BBC, highlights a number of ongoing problems we've had with infrastructure there. Burial workers in Sierra Leone have dumped bodies in public in protest to non-payment of allowances. We've had multiple strikes over recent weeks in Liberia and Sierra Leone by workers who either were not being paid or lacked adequate protective equipment. And this makes it very hard to move forward with our prevention efforts if we don't have sufficient either support of our national health care workers and or their protection. Again, another challenge in what we're talking about. So to sum it up, let's just be very clear. The global leader is UN Secretary General, the Director General, Secretary General of the World Health Organization. Others have been clear and compelling in their message about the need to keep our eye on West Africa and why that's important. I think this is another area where CDC played a very key role early on, trying to highlight the importance of West Africa and why we need to keep our eye on that area, and our response really isolated in a sense to that area. Right now we know we're not going to meet the deadlines that were originally suggested by the UN for 70% of cases being treated and ensuring 70% of safe burials by December 1st. This is clearly the issue in Sierra Leone. Progress in Liberia has been more, but again, recent reported outbreaks in scattered villages out throughout Liberia raise questions about that. I've actually been in contact today with multiple colleagues in these countries in West Africa, all reaffirming the amazing and incredible challenges that still are before us in terms of trying to stop transmission in many of these areas. One point I would like to make is that there has been much made about what we know about this virus and making the assumption that it hasn't changed or this is going to happen. This remains the primary publication, although recently others have raised questions about it. It really elucidates the genetic status of the virus in one localized village city area of Sierra Leone from May. And it really calls the question of why we don't have more information in our current scientific repertoire in terms of what's happening with the virus. And a meeting held at the National Academy of Science Institute of Medicine several weeks ago on research needs for Ebola highlighted the urgent need to obtain more virus isolate samples. This is a complicated area, working with national governments, local organizations on the ground, and international organizations to get this information. But right now, anyone who tells you they know what this virus is all about, genetically or otherwise, really are missing the boat. We have major questions here about this yet. Early on, there were lots of discussions about the inadequate response and why we had not done a better job of quickly recognizing this. In the August 28th World Health Organization Ebola Roadmap, which was first laid out of the response, which very quickly became outdated because of the overwhelming outbreak just blowing right by many of the points of this. Subsequently, an article was published in which WHO admits its bosh's early attempt to stop the disease. As the headline read here, this report has not yet been released. My point is, take a step back, everyone. You know, no one really is at fault for having missed the early signs and been able to do the kind of critical early work, because everybody did. I don't care what country you're in. I don't care what government you work for or what private agency or in terms of international, we really do have a critical issue here in terms of how we respond. And this is going to be something we need to look at very carefully for the future in terms of how we respond, and lessons learned is going to be important. But now is not the time to point fingers at anyone at all. One of the areas that I remain very concerned about is the ability to recruit ongoing healthcare workers. We may be able to build more beds, we may be able to build more treatment units, we may be able to do a lot of things that are all in the right direction, but if we don't have the skilled healthcare workers, both nationally and internationally, to provide that kind of care and follow-up, we're in trouble. And I think right now this is a very, what I call a difficult time in terms of, one, we're in the fog of war where it's unclear what's going on, and some people are perceiving we're pretty much broken the back of this. Do we really need more volunteers on an international level? Number two, who is stepping up anyway? And have we hit the kind of wall that some say this is just not something I want to respond to? And third of all, the holiday season even. We know internationally that providing the international healthcare worker response is always challenging, particularly around the holiday season. This is going to be a key one. Yes, we need protective equipment. Yes, we need beds. We need that. But in the end, the most critical resource we have today yet is still our people. We know we're having other challenges. This article first highlighted the possibility of major food crises. The FAO and others just yesterday made comments about this very issue, that under these very dire conditions in these three affected countries, we need to be mindful of. We're not just providing care for people for their diseases, but also providing water and food for them in their limited ability to obtain that. In terms of looking at the actual efforts, this is an article from October 20th, which highlighted the problems that relief efforts are slow to take off. That was really at the height of when people were concerned about this transmission in a way that some would say bordered on fear. But if you look even this past month at the aid pledged and the actual aid arrived, you can see the dismal kind of support that's been there. And this is one that I give our country great credit for. While much of this relief was slow to get there, we were operating on program or bureaucratic time, and the virus was operating in virus time. We at least did provide the leadership position, both in terms of the voice of need for support, but as well as providing the support. So I'm very proud of the U.S. for that. I ask, where's the rest of the world? And while these are not the most updated numbers, we still have a big gap between many of the countries of the world that could provide support. And again, this is not about just humanitarian aid. This is also about self-interest. It's very clear from the security community, from the intelligence community, that really Equatorial Africa really is vulnerable to collapse if we don't contain this as it is. We in this country still have our own challenges getting the kind of resources. The administration proposed a $6.2 billion emergency funding request, which is still working its way through Congress. We need to have this kind of opportunity now to do this work. We can't do it on the backs of our current budgets. I wrote a piece back again in September talking about this epidemic in Politico, in which I talked about Plan A, B, and C. Plan A was just what we were doing. Plan B was how we're going to keep it from spreading, and Plan C was how we're going to move to the future. And Plan C was all about vaccine. And I remain convinced that this will be an endemic disease of these countries if it doesn't spread into others. If it does spread into others, it'll be even more of a challenge. But in the end, we're going to need vaccine. That's going to be critical. We know that there are experimental drugs and vaccines being considered. We knew that early on in the outbreak. And we're very happy to say that with the vaccine issue, we at least see real potential here. Maybe not immediately, but it's very real that we actually can see this as the best hope for arresting Ebola. To understand the challenges we have where we don't have a licensed vaccine today for Ebola in humans, we have done substantial work in some human primates. The problem is that they are not always the best models. We have insufficient clinical data to assess the comparability between non-human primates and human pathogenesis and immunity, and intervention targeting host functions and drug metabolism for treatment studies clearly may be impacted by subtle species differences. So we're really in the first time trying to do this work. I call it painting the moving train in the populations in West Africa. There are currently 3 primary vaccines under consideration. One has been affectionately known as the chimp adenovirus 3, or associated with the National Institutes of Health and GlaxoSmithKline. There are 2 other VSV vaccines, one with Newlink, and now, as you'll see in a moment, associated with Merck. This was first produced by the Canadian government and licensed to Newlink. And Profestus, a U.S. company, also has another VSV platform vaccine, all addressing Ebola Zaire. Just several weeks ago, the U.S. government invested heavily in the Profestus vaccine, awarding them $5.8 million to move their vaccine forward. And yesterday, a major new announcement was made where Newlink, the Iowa-based company which holds the rights to the Public Health Agency of Canada vaccine, now has just signed a deal with Merck, in which really boosts the prospects for this vaccine moving forward. We know that we're going to start vaccine trials in West Africa in the next month. Activity is already ongoing there. This will include both the GSK chimp adeno vaccine as well as the Newlink Merck VSV vaccine. There's much to work out with this, though. However, I'm part of a group, co-chair a group with Jeremy Farrar from the Wellcome Trust that actually has formed what it's called a Team B, 27 international experts that are actually working to come up with alternative strategies and plans that can challenge our current efforts to get us the safest, most effective vaccine in Africa as soon as possible in the amounts that we need and in a way that the local population will use it. I just want to mention briefly there are a number of Ebola treatments under study also, a number of therapeutic compounds. One that we have heard a lot about is ZMapp, a triple monoclonal antibody cocktail. There's an antibody infusion. I won't go into that more today to say that that has become a common response kind of thing to plasmapheresis, someone who's recovered, and provide that antibody infusion. I must add that the data are very, very unclear that there's really any clinical benefit to this, yet we continue to do it, but we need more information. And then the final treatment area under consideration is viral polymerase inhibitors. The first trials for Ebola treatments will start at the MSS sites this next month. While we recognize that primary care, just fluids, electrolyte support, are really the first line and most important line right now, Ebola drugs may have a potential real role in this outbreak ongoing. It'll be a challenge, of course, economically, and again from a drug treatment efficacy and a manufacturing standpoint, licensure to get these drugs in time. In care for the severely ill Ebola patients, we've learned clearly from the United States that with the kind of therapeutic interventions we've seen used here in people being treated in the United States, we can take Ebola from being an almost always fatal disease to one in which it is not. And I think this is an important point. So we clearly will need to continue to investigate intensive care methods in of themselves, and that what can we do here to improve on that in the field in Africa. We have anecdotal reports suggesting aggressive approach to clinical care can improve survival rates. These are from the cases here in the U.S., targeted repletion of fluids and electrolytes, monitoring treatment for co-infections, and even nutritional support. Let me just say that I won't go into this much beyond the fact that we all recognize and understand the challenges that we had when we had the first Ebola cases diagnosed in Texas and what that meant, both in terms of the public's understanding of what Ebola meant to this country, our messaging and how we approach that messaging, and also just how we protected our healthcare workers. Suffice it to say, on articles like this, it was not helpful that, again, the public health community was challenged as such about what we did, but I think we did learn some valuable lessons. One of them is that we have to be very careful not to overstate what we know and don't know. And we can still have a voice of authority about what we know and don't know, and making absolute statements, which we are doing today and continue to do, I think is a challenge. There's issues around travel and travel bans and how we deal with healthcare workers. I have said all along we can both protect the public and treat healthcare workers with dignity and scientific evidence without one or the other. And I think the real question is how we best do that. I think the graduated monitoring system we have is actually very helpful. I think we have to be careful. If we have one healthcare worker that does transmit in this country after returning, that will be the flea on the hair, on the tail of the dog, not the body of what we know. But we have to understand that could fundamentally change how people perceive this. So how can we accomplish both? And I think we don't want healthcare workers to feel shunned or to feel maligned by some kind of mandatory quarantine. And so I think, again, the graduated program we have today makes great sense. We've seen people back off this mandatory quarantine of almost being locked in your house, and I think that's a good thing. In terms of healthcare worker protection, we had been outspoken about that issue for some time, saying that we need better protection. And as you saw after the Dallas cases, we did have that. CDC unveiled new PPE guidance for Ebola back in October. One of the lessons we learned here is we do not need or want 5,000 hospitals able to take care of Ebola patients. Every healthcare worker in the United States needs to be able to recognize a possible case, meaning that, in fact, if someone has been in West Africa or has contact with someone who is in West Africa who is ill, and I should say during the roughly 21-day time period, and presents with vomiting, diarrhea, with or without fever, you have to be able to evaluate those patients safely for the workers and effectively for the patient. And I think today we're much further along in this country with a system in place at each community level area to actually help healthcare workers identify potential patients, move them safely to a place where adequate evaluation can be done, and then if they're found to have Ebola, where good medical care can be provided and healthcare workers can work safely with the level of protection they're provided and the training that they've now received. One of the areas I think that's going to be a challenge is we do know that we are going to have increasing demands for protective gear. Today in the Wall Street Journal there's an article addressing that very issue about potential shortages of PPE because of the rapid purchase by so many organizations. And this is an area we're going to have to monitor very carefully. We need to have PPE on the front lines of the battle in West Africa, and we can't run into shortages, and so this is an area that will require ongoing monitoring and activity if necessary. Let me just say at the end, this meeting that I mentioned at the National Academy of Science Institute of Medicine really did highlight a number of uncertainties. The issue of airborne transmission, our group believes that it absolutely does occur or potentially can occur in the patient setting, not the community setting. This idea that we are or are not having airborne transmission is unfortunate. If you look at the idea of creating aerosols in the patient care area, if you look at projectile vomiting with diseases like norovirus, etc., there's a lot of information that would support that this is a possibility. So one day if we have to retract on is there airborne transmission, this shouldn't be one where we create a crisis, and yet we've been drawing these very solid, bright lines around this issue. We know we have patients that have onset beyond 21 days. Again, this is, what I call the flea on the hair or on the tail of the dog. The vast majority are going to occur within 21 days. So we will have ongoing questions. Our group was publishing a paper on a comprehensive review on transmission in the near term, which will be, I'm sure, covered on our site. We will make that available to all of you, which really addresses many of these questions. So yes, in fact, the vast majority of transmission, if not almost all of it, is body fluid contact, but we can't say all of it is. So let me just conclude by saying we're in uncharted territories. And as Lewis Carroll said, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. And this is a challenge for us because, in part, we don't know where we're going in some cases because conditions on the ground, the future is very unpredictable. And we're going to have to be basically making up our travel itinerary as we go. And this is something we just have to get more comfortable with. And finally, I'd conclude by just saying, as Ebenezer Scrooge once said during this holiday season, are these the shadows of the things that will be, or the shadows of the things that may be only? And I think that we still have a lot of questions about what that will be in terms of the future with Ebola in Africa. And until we have an adequate and safe vaccine, which we hope is not many, many months off, but it will be some months off, we really are left with our primary public health and medical care practices to try to stop and reduce this particular epidemic. So with that, I'll conclude, and I will go ahead and open it up to questions and any comments. So One of the first questions that came in was the question, can you comment on the role that Cuba is playing, and just in general, any other questions that have come up as it relates to other countries working in the theater. As you know, Cuba was one of the first U.S. or non-U.S. governments to actually completely staff an Ebola treatment center by themselves, and they have been there. We're seeing more and more support coming in from other countries. Again, the real backbone still has been the NGOs that have continued to provide really very important care, as well as a growing presence of USAID-supported activities there, both with NGOs and just from the military-built clinics. Ultimately, the big issue remains just the need for healthcare workers, public health workers to be there, and for the ongoing intervention with the communities. And it's really unclear just how working with these communities will continue. The trust issues, the cultural issues are really, really very critical. Right now, another question is, agree prevention and vaccines is the most effective way to go. Now, 2 of the potential vaccines are being developed using Ebola Zaire, and the article about genomics and the characteristics of the current epidemic point to the fact that it seems to be a different strain from Zaire. There is nothing that says this is a different strain than Zaire. It is a Zaire. The question is how much strain difference can occur there, and we really have no evidence yet that we really have that says that this vaccine won't work. The key real indicator is going to be when we actually begin clinical trials to say that we should in fact or the vaccine will or won't protect, and that will give us the answer we're looking for. I'm confident at this point. I think that the vaccine will work. I believe that at least one of the candidate vaccines has a very high possibility of working, but we'll see. This is a question that's coming in from a number of different people, but you know, me saying we have a lot to learn about Ebola, there's no absolutes, but why do I say a travel ban is not a good idea? Let me just make 2 points about that issue. One is that we could, as we learned in HIV/AIDS and we've learned in SARS and so forth, you can make all kinds of very overreaching recommendations that can try to provide 100% of safety to everyone. And all I would say in that situation here is that, yes, you can argue that we wouldn't worry about it in the rest of the world if we could really stop all movement in and out of West Africa, which by itself is very challenging, let me just say, because people don't have to leave from these countries to fly somewhere else. But number 2 is look at what's happened over the past 45 days. We have not seen the kind of transmission that some people worried about outside of West Africa by people traveling to or from West Africa. And, you know, will we have potential cases arriving somewhere unsuspected in the world? That's possible. But we do know with a travel ban, you greatly hinder the ability to interface in West Africa, moving people in, supplies in. And while the military is surely helping with that logistical support right now, we still count on private aircraft and the world's airlines to help us with that issue. So to me, the trade-off I feel very confident with that we're doing the right thing. And I think, again, the last 45 days said that this is not going to continue to be lots and lots of cases coming out of West Africa. I think the U.S. government's follow-up right now of individuals coming out of West Africa, even with direct flights or at least with one ticket flights, meaning that they may transfer in Europe, but their ticket is to the United States or another country in the Western Hemisphere, or those who even have broken tickets where they fly to Europe, get another ticket to fly to the United States. We really are picking those up. And I think that in that regard, I feel very confident that we're doing quite a bit about that. A lot of questions here about monitoring. I think most of you know right now, as I just mentioned, I'll re-emphasize it again, that in fact I believe we are capturing most, if not almost all, of the individuals flying out of West Africa coming to the United States. State health departments are being notified by Homeland Security, working with the CDC in terms of people arriving in the individual states from some location from West Africa, and I think the system is actually going quite well. We really are able to learn of people who may have been exposed and to work with them on a daily basis. At the same time, let me just say, there's a sense that people who might be infected would not present themselves to medical care quickly. That actually really is to me, not an issue. we have demonstrated quite clearly early medical care is the key to survival. And if you have adequate medical care, you basically increase your chances dramatically of surviving that illness. So why would you not, if you had your first hangnail and you thought that you might actually, that might be a symptom of early onset Ebola, not wanting to seek medical care very quickly? So there's a real incentive here for people to be able to avail health care quickly and to want to seek it, not want to run from it. So we've also had a question here, if you should continue travel into Africa. We have several questions about that. I would say right now, if you're not in the affected countries, either Sierra Leone, Guinea, or Liberia, or now Mali, really the risk of Ebola at this point is really no different than if you travel to any other area outside of Africa. We will stay tuned to that very carefully, make sure that we know if there's evidence of spread out there, but I would not change any of your travel to Africa outside of these 4 countries right now based on Ebola. Even if you do have a need to go to one of these 4 countries, I would say do not cancel your plans, but depending on why you're going, who you might have contact with, this is where you need to work closely with public health officials and those institutions on the ground in these countries to understand how you can protect yourself. Now, the issue of Ebola terrorism, it's a question that's come up multiple times here too. Is this a feasible or a real security issue, or is this just paranoia? Let me answer this question in a way that is a bit uncomfortable for me to say. I refuse to talk about Ebola terrorism in public settings from the standpoint that I think that discussing it would not be helpful in terms of the potential encouragement to occur. I think that should tell you our concerns about it and what could be done. And so it's a real issue. We need to be mindful of it, but I think that the less said about it in terms of what or how or why is probably better right now, and just say, yes, we need to be really mindful of it. Questions have come up, is there going to be sufficient participation by the community in the affected countries to participate in future clinical trials for vaccines or therapies? And this is a real challenge. On our Team B group that I mentioned to you, we currently have 7 leading African scientists who are involved with this. We're interfacing with sociologists, anthropologists on the ground there to understand how we best interface with the community. And we do know that this is a challenge. Even in the face of a very serious Ebola epidemic, cultural issues surely can be a challenge to giving people the support and the information they need to agree to participate in these studies. And so we do not take this lightly. I would say that it would be terribly unfortunate if we have safe, effective vaccines available and people won't take them. This could clearly be a real problem. And so this is a very good point, and we would hopefully address this as we go forward in terms of how to best engage the local community into supporting vaccines. We've clearly seen changes, particularly in Liberia, where cultural practices have been addressed, and while these are incremental changes, it's also quite remarkable that in a short period of time, local communities have understood why and how they need to reduce their risk of Ebola transmission, and so hopefully this will be part of it. There is a question here about how will the upcoming flu season affect our diagnosis of Ebola in the U.S. Again, I don't think that should be a big issue, because no one should come into your medical care facility that doesn't report to you, or someone reported to you before they got there, that in fact they have traveled to West Africa. So, you know, this is clearly not even looking for zebras, but looking for unicorns in terms of people coming into your emergency rooms, your outpatient clinics, your urgent cares. You know, I've said and have said it for some time, you know, after you ascertain whether the patient is alive or dead because they're talking to you, the next question you need to ask is, do you have a travel history in the recent months? And if you do, then, and if West Africa is part of that, then it's still a very high likelihood that whatever their illness is not due to Ebola, but you then at that point have to entertain that possibility. Someone without a travel history to West Africa, Ebola is just not on the screen. I think that One of the issues that's going to be more challenging, and I don't mean to throw a monkey wrench in today's Ebola talk, but there was a very important paper that was just published by the group at the NIH this past week, in which they now have a human challenge study protocol set up at the NIH, and they just published on their first paper looking at H1N1 transmission, where they intentionally infected people, and they found that only about 10% of the patients who developed full-blown influenza actually had a detectable fever. We've often used fever as a hallmark sign for influenza, and what we don't know is where we just basically catching the tip of the iceberg, because many more won't have fever. So I would just add for all of you out there, just remember that in fact maybe fever isn't the only sign and symptom combination that you need to look at in terms of the influenza. A number of questions here about public health activity both in Africa and here. And I think if there's any message that should come across loud and clear, is that public health is not something that can be purchased just when it's needed. Same thing is true with medical care. Our inability to respond in West Africa was in large part due early on to an absence of an adequate medical care or public health systems in place. Even in this country, where public health is really bearing the weight of the follow-up with Ebola in terms of people returning, the public's questions, the healthcare worker interface, we recognize that you can't go out and buy a fire truck, you know, that at the moment the 911 call comes in with smoke. And we have to sustain public health. And one of the messages I hope that becomes loud and clear is we can't go from episode to episode, from crisis to crisis. And we're going to need much more sustainability in this area. And we're having discussions with lawmakers, with policymakers, why this is so important. And I think if nothing else, this is something that we need to consider long term. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up and turn it back over to John, who will then make an introduction here. And thank you all very much. I know this has been a lot of information to cover, and there's a lot more we could have covered, but I appreciate your time, and thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you, Dr. Osterholm. That was a very comprehensive and useful webinar. I learned a lot myself. And before we wrap up, I want to introduce one of his colleagues who works at SidReach. His name is Aaron Desmond, and he is the Associate Director of Outreach and Development for SidReach, responsible for external communications and development. And he is also an alum of the University of Minnesota. He earned his MBA degree from the Carlson School of Management. Welcome, Aaron.
Great. Thank you, John. And I would like to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. Your interest and engagement really is critical to ensuring a sustained international response to the ongoing epidemic, even as media attention in the U.S. wanes. I'd also like to recognize the Benson Foundation for their financial support of SidReach's outreach efforts. It helps make events such as this webinar possible. As our time available for today's webinar is nearly up, I would like to share with you two opportunities relating to what you can do to stay engaged on this and other infectious disease issues and to help support SidReach's work. Firstly, as the global infectious disease landscape is constantly changing, keeping current with the latest authoritative news and perspective is essential to staying properly informed. SidReach's full-time team of seasoned reporters and editors provide original news articles and expert commentaries each business day to help you stay connected. All of our articles are publicly available without charge and are available at the URL on your screen, www.sidreach.umn.edu. Secondly, if you're interested in supporting SidReach's work to combat Ebola and other emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases, please consider joining other individuals from across the country as well as around the world in making a donation to help fund our work. We rely heavily on the financial support of individuals like you, corporations, and foundations to deliver on our mission. There's 3 areas that we're working on right now, including conducting a comprehensive review of information on the Ebola virus transmission to inform national and international response policies. In collaboration with the Wellcome Trust, we have assembled an international team of subject matter experts to inform the effort to ensure that we have the global public health community, international governments, and the pharmaceutical industry take every opportunity to deliver as soon as possible an effective Ebola vaccine. And finally, as I mentioned before, our seasoned public health news team is publishing hundreds of articles to help inform frontline clinicians, public health officials, and policymakers, as well as the general public, to stay informed. Please consider supporting us through the URL on the website. Your gift in any amount is deeply appreciated. And with that, I'd like to hand the floor back over to John to conclude the webinar.
Thank you, Aaron. We have some additional webinars coming up in the next few months on wide-ranging and engaging topics. In December, we have a really great one from alum Matt Chua on making the most of international travel. In January, we're doing a webinar with actually the career director of the School of Public Health, Vic Masalia, on dreaming big and setting goals, your New Year's playbook as far as maybe scratching that New Year's resolution itch. And then in February, we're doing a panel with recruiters on the job search inside scoop. If you're on social media, be sure to connect with the University of Minnesota Alumni Association on Twitter. We have a very active LinkedIn group, over 28,000 alumni and friends and students in that group, or visit our main webpage to see all of our different social media channels. In closing, members of the University of Minnesota Alumni Association make new initiatives like this webinar series possible. Thank you so much for your support. Because of members, we can enrich the lives of alumni, support student success, and make a better University of Minnesota. Become a member today at minnesotaalumni.org/join. This is the conclusion of today's webinar. Thank you for joining us and for being an active member of the worldwide community of University of Minnesota alumni and friends. Thank you.